We stand today at a crossroads, not just of economics, but of identity, of who we are as a nation and who we are becoming. When Vice President J.D. Vance declared, "We're done being the piggy bank of the entire world," he wasn't merely talking about tariffs or trade deficits. He was drawing a line in the sand, between a past where America subsidized the prosperity of others at the expense of her own people, and a future that insists on reciprocity, fairness, and strength.
The tariffs. There's been some retaliation, some signals at least in the media that Canada is going to respond, some of these others are going to respond to the president's tariffs. What's your message for Americans that are going to see costs increase on auto manufacturing, new cars, that kind of thing? Is it Buy America, or what's the message going forward there?
Well, we say a couple of things. First of all, for the Canadians, and we have many dear friends in Canada, and of course we love the Canadian people, but the Canadian leadership threatening retaliatory tariffs against the United States, as President Trump often says, they just don't have the cards. There is no way that Canada can win a trade war with the United States. What President Trump has said is that he wants to level the playing field. For decades, Canadian leadership has forced American farmers and American manufacturers to play by an unfair set of rules. All President Trump has said is that we're done playing by an unfair set of rules. If you're going to do something to our industries, then we're going to do something back to your industries. That's how you protect American manufacturing, and that's how you protect American jobs. Now, what I say to the American people is look, the president ran on this, and he said very clearly that we're done being the piggy bank of the entire world. For 40 years, in the same way that our European friends, I think, have neglected international security, for 40 years, a lot of our friends all over the world have used America as a piggy bank. They have used us to absorb all of their excess economic production. What does that mean for Americans? For Americans, that's meant manufacturing jobs declining. That's meant middle-class wages going down. That's meant whole towns that have been hollowed out by empty factories, and that means in America that is less safe because our manufacturing isn't as powerful now as it was 30 years ago. I've got all these brave Americans in front of me and a few behind me too. We want to send, if God forbid we have to send Americans to war, we want them to have weapons, the best weapons in the world that are manufactured in America and not in China. The way you do that is to rebuild the American manufacturing sector. The days of America being the piggy bank of the world, the days of closed factories, the days of people not being able to get a middle-class job in this country, they're over. And yes, that means we're going to have to fight back even against some of our friends and their unfair economic practices. But the long-term consequence of this is going to be higher wages, more manufacturing, and more economic security for the American people. Take a couple more questions.
For decades, the American middle class, our builders, farmers, welders, and machinists, have watched as factories shuttered, wages stagnated, and hope withered. Policies crafted under the banner of globalization often failed to acknowledge the complexity of human nature, which thrives not in rootless abstractions but in rooted communities. We were told that free trade would lift all boats. But many of our towns didn't float, they sank. Vice President Vance's message pierces through the noise with clarity. It speaks with the moral authority of someone willing to critique the status quo, not for the sake of confrontation, but for the sake of correction. That takes intellectual humility, the courage to ask not just, what is being said, but, what has been overlooked? Let us be honest. This is not simply a discussion about Canada or tariffs. It is a discussion about sovereignty, economic security, and truth. Vance's statement that Canada doesn't have the cards to win a trade war with the United States isn't bluster, it's an analytical observation rooted in economic scale, dependency, and leverage. It's also a confrontation with comfortable narratives that have too long escaped critique. This new approach honors something often forgotten in international discourse, the psychological necessity of self-respect. No nation can thrive if its workers are treated as expendable, if its industries are outsourced, if its identity is hollowed out to meet the expectations of global elites. And make no mistake, this change isn't emotional recklessness. It is reasoned spontaneity, the careful, engaged decision to fight for long-term stability by confronting short-term turbulence. Yes, prices may rise. Yes, allies may protest. But what is the cost of continuing down the same road that led us here? More dependence? More economic division? More silence from those who once had a voice? There is a delicate balance, one that this administration is trying to strike. On one hand, we embrace dialogue even when it's difficult. We respect our allies even when we disagree. But we also insist that clarity must trump convenience. If the rules are unfair, we must change them. If others retaliate, we must respond, not out of rage, but out of necessity. That's what constructive dialogue looks like. That's what clarity of vision demands. That's what an engaged, intellectually honest, and self-reflective policy must do. In that sense, this is more than trade, it's a cultural course correction. It's about re-establishing a system that works for ordinary Americans and not just for multinational corporations or foreign governments. It's about making sure that the next generation doesn't inherit rusted-out factories and hollowed-out towns, but opportunity, pride, and purpose. Let us also acknowledge that these decisions bring tension. The psychological terminology is apt. It's a moment of cognitive dissonance, when we must choose between the comfort of old illusions and the clarity of new truths. Vice President Vance didn't shy away from this. He embraced it. He said, in essence, we're willing to endure discomfort now, so we don't collapse later. Critics argue about inflation. They raise concerns about diplomatic tension. And we must listen to those critiques, not defensively, but analytically. But let us not allow temporary fears to derail a necessary renaissance. What we are witnessing is a narrative rebirth. A reclaiming of the American story from the hands of abstraction and return to the ground of reality. We are finally saying, we matter. Our workers matter. Our communities matter. This is not protectionism for its own sake, it is protection with purpose. From a historical lens, this moment mirrors past cycles. In the late 1800s, America used protective tariffs to build its industrial strength. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't perfect. But it worked. Contrast that with the last 40 years, where liberalized trade agreements, GATT, NAFTA, the WTO, promised unity but often delivered division. Now, it's time to reimagine, not to reject dialogue, but to elevate it. Not to avoid criticism, but to refine policy through it. As Vance said, we must be prepared to stand up even against our friends, not to betray them, but to insist on mutual respect. That takes empathy rooted in authenticity. We need intense listening. We need self-critique. We need careful words, grounded in truth, not just for the cameras, but for the soul of the Republic. In closing, this moment challenges us all, not just as policymakers or pundits, but as citizens. Are we willing to accept the psychological burden of transformation? Are we open to insight, to rebuilding, to systematizing what was once broken? The answer, I believe, must be yes. Let us walk forward, not with anger, but with conviction. Not with arrogance, but with purpose. Not with division, but with the disciplined pursuit of justice, truth, and renewal. Because the era of America as the world's piggy bank is over. And the era of principled strength has just begun.